The bell tolled once, low, hollow, distant, and then was swallowed by the mist, and Selma did not flinch. She simply stood there, her breath clouding in the cold, her arms slack at her sides. The rope had passed her now, drifting like a dead serpent along the current, trailing toward a bend where the reeds grew tall and black. She had once believed bells to be divine voices, summoned only to announce joy, birth, weddings, or the death of a soul passed into light. But this bell did not carry upward, it sank. It sounded not above her, but inside her, as though it had rung from within the marrow of her spine. She took a step forward, and the mud beneath her heel gave way with a wet sigh. Each pace toward the sound pulled her deeper into silence. Trees stood like gaunt sentinels, bare and watching, their bark cracked with age and rot, their limbs reaching not to heaven but across the path, as if to clutch at sleeves to stop her passage. The scent of the fire still clung to her skin, singed hair, sweat, soot, and she carried it like a shroud. Whatever holiness had clothed her in the abbey was gone now. The river did not care for vows. As the mist thickened, she felt the ground slope downward, subtly, then more steeply, until the path vanished into silt and wet stone. A wooden marker lay half buried in moss, the shape of a wheel carved into it, the old sigil of the ferryman. Guild, disbanded decades ago. She remembered the tales. When the plague took the eastern quarter, the ferrymen were the first to seal the crossings, letting the sick die with prayers unanswered on the other shore. That was the last time this path was walked with purpose. Since then, the river was left to itself and to whatever old grief it harbored beneath its calm. Anselma reached the edge of the embankment, where the reeds bent low like supplicants, and the water widened into a dark, glassy corridor. A boat waited. No one stood in it. No rope tied it to land. Yet it did not drift. It waited, as if it had always known she would come. The oar rested in place. A lantern swung faintly from the prow, casting a pale circle on the water, to dim, to light her way. Too stubborn to die, she stepped in. The hull groaned beneath her weight, not with protest, but memory. This boat had carried many. The worn grooves on the planks beneath her knees told stories, some scratched in with nails, others left by blood, salt, or the soft decay of tears. She did not push off, she simply sat, and the boat obeyed. It turned gently, soundlessly, and began to move. The current here was slow, but deliberate. The wind no longer moved. The trees did not whisper. The only sound was the occasional clink of the lantern chain tapping the wooden beam, and the soft rustle of her breath catching. In her throat, she thought of the abbey, of Sister Isolde, who once braided her hair in the mornings with silent devotion, who had pressed a kiss to her temple the night the bishop came to question their prayers. She thought of the child they buried beneath the chapel floor, the one born too pale, too silent, and how no one had spoken his name since. The fire had erased all of that, but her memory would not. It was the only thing she had salvaged. Time stretched thin across the river, her fingers numbed. Somewhere to her left, a shape moved long, slender, just beneath the surface. It never broke the water, but trailed beside her for a while. Then it was gone. She whispered nothing. Not a plea, not a prayer. Her voice belonged to the abbey, and the abbey was ash. The lantern flickered, the fog parted. And then she saw it, a stone pier, half submerged, leading to a stairway carved into the cliffside. Above it, a single structure loomed, hidden mostly by ivy and rot. It was not a village, it was not a church, it looked more like a vault or a tomb. Yet the bell hung there, cracked, corroded, still warm from the sound it had just given. She stepped from the boat, feet sinking slightly into the damp moss of the landing. She looked once back toward the river. The boat was already drifting away, with no sound of oars, no farewell. She was not meant to return. She climbed. The steps were uneven, worn by more than weather, as if thousands of feet had passed here. Long ago, always upward, never down. A faint red cloth hung from the railing post, not a banner, but a scrap of something once sacred. A veil, torn. Her breath quickened. At the summit, she stood before the great door. It bore no markings, no lock, only a handprint burned into the wood, small, feminine, seared black, where flesh once met fate. She raised her palm and laid it over the mark. The wood was cold. Inside, she heard something move, not footsteps, but a gathering, like robes shifting in unison, like people kneeling or rising. The air grew colder. Her knees gave way slowly, not in weakness, but in recognition. This place was not new to her. It had been waiting. The bell rang again, and this time she understood its tone. It was not summoning, it was remembering. The abbey had burned, but its secrets had come here, and now, so had she. The door did not open with a creak, nor with defiance. It simply gave in, never been locked, as if it had always been waiting for her weight, her warmth, her breath. The wood swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a corridor veiled in dusk, not quite dark, not quite light, just enough to make her wonder if her eyes were betraying her, or if the air itself refused to hold clarity. She stepped across the threshold. Inside, the air was colder than she had imagined, but not in the way of winter. It was the cold of breath withheld for too long, the cold of cloisters sealed in silence, the kind that curled around your wrists like invisible manacles and sank into your lungs like forgotten prayers. She felt it press beneath her ribcage, rapping gently, as though to remind her, you do not belong here, but you are still expected. No candles lined the walls, no torches burned, yet the walls glowed faintly, not from flame, but from memory. Faded frescoes whispered along the stone, depicting scenes too weathered to make sense. A woman veiled in blue with blood dripping from her palms. A flock of black birds flying upward through a staircase. A robed figure placing a crown of fire on a kneeling child. The images seemed to change the longer she looked. Or perhaps they were never still to begin with. Her footsteps echoed, not against stone, but against time. It felt as if the sound reached backward, tapping gently against centuries. The corridor sloped gently downward. She followed. She passed alcoves filled with relics, some recognizable, a cracked chalice, a string of bone-carved rosary beads, a child's wooden shoe, others unknowable, wrapped in cloth or sealed in glass. Each item had weight, not in matter, but in grief. None of them felt abandoned, only held. At the end of the corridor, a small wooden door stood ajar. Its frame was warped with damp, its surface etched with dozens of shallow marks, not letters, not language, just scratches. Some looked desperate, others measured, like someone had been keeping time or carving reminders they feared would be erased. She pushed the door open. The room inside was circular, made of old brick and mortar, laced with moss and iron rings. It was a chamber not meant for gatherings, but for watching. And in its center stood a chair, plain, backless, its seat polished by years of occupation. Around it, concentric circles were drawn into the floor with what looked like chalk, but smelled like ash. A single rope hung from the ceiling, frayed at the end, as though once tied to something or someone. She stepped closer. The walls bore more frescoes, but these were clearer, untouched by weather or time. One showed a river flowing with red water, another a tower split down the middle, bleeding fire. And at the center of all of them, in every painting, no matter the chaos, stood a woman with her face turned away, always present, never seen. And Selma reached for the rope, fingers brushing the end. It was warm. A breath behind her. A rustle of cloth. She turned quickly, but there was no one. The chamber was still, but the air had changed. She was not alone. A voice, faint as wind, "You've come through the fire." She did not respond. Her throat was tight, but the voice did not demand an answer. Few do fewer return. Another silence. Then a shift. A door within the chamber she had not seen before, carved into the stone with no frame, just a hollow beyond. From it came the scent of sage smoke and wet stone. She moved toward it, drawn not by force, but by familiarity. The hallway it opened into was lower than the last, the ceiling almost brushing her head, the walls lined with shelves carved directly into the rock. Scrolls lay there, brittle and wrapped in wax cloth, some crumbling at the edges, others bound, shut with thread dyed the color of bruises. She dared not touch them, but as she passed, one scroll fell, not tumbled, not slipped, but fell flat, as if placed. Its seal was broken, its ribbon unfurled. She crouched. The parchment bore ink, faded to brown, but she could still read the name at the top. Her own Anselma of Thornwood, admitted under fire, released upon return. Below, a symbol, the wheel. Again, beneath it, a date older than her birth by centuries. She stood up too quickly, dizziness blooming behind her eyes. Her chest pounded, not from fear, but from recognition too deep to name. She turned, but the hall behind her was no longer the same. The path had shifted, the stones rearranged. It was not a place she could leave the way she came. The final chamber opened before her, like the nave of a buried cathedral. Vaulted stone above columns shaped like reaching arms, and at the center, a pool, wide, still, perfectly circular, its water darker than pitch. Around it stood figures, not statues, people, robed, silent, unmoving, faces veiled, hands clasped. Their presence pulsed like a heart in the dark. One of them turned to her. She could not see its eyes, but she felt the weight of its gaze, like judgment, like memory, like being seen entirely. The figure raised a hand, palm outward. She matched it. Their palms did not meet. But in the space between them, something passed. A recognition, a torch handed from one story to the next. The figure stepped aside. A stone stairway spiraled downward. Into the pool, its surface did not ripple. She knew then, without being told, this was not a test. This was a rite. She had escaped the fire. But now, she would have to walk into the water and bear the river's memory. She stepped forward. The water did not resist. The veiled figures began to hum, low, harmonic, a song not meant for ears, but for marrow. With every step down, the darkness rose, not as punishment, but as passage. And before she vanished beneath the final ripple, she remembered the bell, not as warning, but as invitation. The first sensation was not cold, it was weight, a heaviness that pressed not just on her skin, but behind her eyes, into her chest, between her bones. The water clung to her robe, like sorrow that had waited too long to be named. Every thread soaked, every breath suspended. The pool swallowed her without a splash. There was no resistance, no chaos, only descent. Her bare feet found the steps beneath the surface, worn smooth by centuries of passage. The river was still above, but down here it whispered, not with voices, but with memories. The scrape of a wooden spoon in a monastery kitchen, the muffled weeping of a girl in the cloister garden, the first scream of a child never meant to be born. The sound curled through her ears like candle smoke in a sealed room. She could not cover her ears, and even if she could, the sounds were not coming from without. They were coming from within. She kept walking. The darkness grew thicker. Not pitch, not absence, but texture. It had a body, a pulse. Occasionally she passed alcoves carved into the walls, lit faintly by pale moss that glowed with the sick light of things that grow without sun. Inside the alcoves were relics, again, not of saints, but of those forgotten. A braid of hair tied with crimson thread, a handkerchief with stitched prayers, worn illegible, a child's doll with glass, eyes cracked like ice underfoot, offerings, reminders, proof. The deeper she went, the harder it was to remember what had burned behind her. The abbey felt further away now, not in distance, but in shape. Its angles were fading, its sounds receding. The screams had stopped. The bell, too, even sister. Isolde's face was softening into mist. She reached a landing. Before her stood an arch, old iron-rimmed, warped with rust. At its crown, a symbol carved into the stone. Two hands bound at the wrist with reeds, surrounded by thorns. Beneath it, engraved in Latin, were the words, Omnis flamma aqua memorabit. Every flame shall be remembered by water. Anselma stepped through, and there, in the chamber beyond, the water disappeared, not by receding, but by being forgotten. One step, and she was dry, not warm, not cold, simply untouched. Her robes no longer clung. Her hair no longer dripped. Her skin bore no gooseflesh. It was as if the river had never touched her, or had touched her so thoroughly it had taken every trace with it. The room was round again, but vast. A domed vault, with no visible ceiling, only a high darkness that echoed faintly with the sound of slow, distant breathing. And in the center of the space, a figure. She was kneeling, back turned, veiled, motionless. Anselma approached slowly, her own breath quieted as if out of reverence or fear. Her boots did not echo, her heartbeat did. As she neared, she saw that the woman's veil was not cloth, but a net of fine silver chains draped over a mask carved from polished bone. Her robes were ink-dark, embroidered with thread the color of dried blood. Her hands rested, palm down, on her knees, still as stone. But her mouth moved, barely forming words Anselma could not hear, but somehow understood. You have brought the flame. Anselma swallowed, but said nothing. You have lost your name. She nodded. Then you may carry another. The woman did not rise. She did not lift her mask, but the air around her shifted, Not wind, not sound, as if something ancient had stirred in the soil beneath their feet. The walls breathed, the shadows leaned in. From the base of the dome, pale figures began to emerge, one by one, neither alive nor dead, but somewhere in the middle, robed, silent, their faces obscured by veils of ash-colored cloth. Each one bore a relic in their hands. The first stepped forward and placed a feathered quill on the ground before Anselma, a writing tool carved from the wing of a drowned gull, a symbol of witness. The second laid down a shard of mirror, blackened at the edges, the reflection twisted, a symbol of memory of the self once known, now bent. The third brought a bell, small, bronze, cracked, no clapper inside. A bell that would ring only if shaken by wind alone, a symbol of silence. One by one, the relics circled her feet, forming a ring of objects no longer used but never discarded. The ritual was not loud, it was not violent. It was the sound of memory being arranged like bones in a grave, precisely, reverently. Then came the final relic, a length of red thread, frayed at both ends. The veiled woman reached out, not with her hands, but with a single gesture, a tilt of the head, a breath caught in stillness. The thread lifted, moved, wrapped itself gently around Anselma's wrists, binding them without touch. And in that binding, she felt it, the river's curse. Not a curse of death, but of remembrance. She was not damned, she was chosen, not to forget, but to carry the weight of those who had burned, of those who had drowned, of those who had prayed to walls that never listened. "You are the vessel," the woman said, her voice not aloud but all around. "You are the fire that walks upon water." And then the chains lifted, the figures withdrew. The room darkened, not from absence, but from closure. The ritual was complete. She stood alone again, but she was not alone. The thread around her wrists pulsed once a heartbeat, foreign and old. And behind her, a passage opened, narrow, lined with iron sconces and breathing stone, lit not by flame, but by memory. She stepped into it, and the veil behind her fell, not from the woman's face, but from her own eyes. She did not weep, she did not speak, she simply walked, because now she remembered. She was not the novice, she was not Anselma, the orphan, she was the vessel of the drowned queen's memory, the flame that would never die. And in the halls ahead, the next name waited, not to be spoken, but to be earned. The path narrowed as she walked. The air in the tunnel grew warmer, denser, as though the earth itself was drawing breath through stone lungs. And Selma's hands, still bound by the red thread, tingled with a presence not her own. Each step seemed to echo not only around her, but within her, as if her bones had become hollow, like cathedral walls, ready to carry sound, memory, and silence alike. The sconces lining the tunnel were wrought from blackened iron, twisted in two, shapes that mimicked roots and ribs, each holding a wick that burned without flame, only a pale shimmer, like the last memory of light, flickering in reverence. They did not offer warmth, they offered clarity. Their glow revealed old carvings along the corridor walls, etched names in forgotten alphabets, prayers in dead languages, symbols of faith no longer spoken in daylight. Some names were scratched, shallow, and frantic, as though the person had not been permitted to stay long. Others were carved deep, patiently, carefully, like offerings. Some were crossed out violently, defiantly, and Anselma paused at one of these, her fingertips hovering just above the gouged letters. She could not read them, but the feeling they carried was unmistakable. Shame, erasure, a soul buried. Twice, once in flesh, and once in story. She walked onward. The corridor spilled into a great rotunda, a circular chamber carved from the mountain's heart. Above her, the ceiling stretched upward beyond sight, cloaked in darkness, as if the sky itself had been buried. At the room's center stood a vast stone column, wide as a tower's base, reaching from floor to ceiling. It was carved on all sides, names upon names, layer upon layer, spiraling upward like vines of memory. Some of the script glowed faintly, pulsing with a soft, internal light. Others remained dark, sleeping, forgotten, or waiting to be remembered. This was the Hall of Names. It was said to be older than any abbey, older even than the river's curse, a place not merely to record the dead, but to bear witness to the unlived. Names of those lost in childbirth, in plague, in exile. Names of those who vanished without song, without stone, without notice. Women burned for knowledge, men flayed for doubt. Children taken before breath could form memory. The column knew them all. It did not judge, it did not forgive, it simply remembered. Anselma approached the column, her steps slow, reverent. Her bound hands pulsed again, once, then again, a rhythm aligned with something deeper than heartbeat. Her name, she sensed, was already here, carved before she was born, placed before she could earn it. The column stirred, not in movement, but in recognition. A sound echoed from the walls, not a voice, not music, but something in between. A resonance, ancient and soft, like wet parchment peeling from stone, or breath returning to lungs long still. The light within some names began to shift, shimmer, then fade. Others flared, brief as a memory in a dream. Then came the voice. It was neither male nor female, neither loud nor soft. It spoke without sound, yet filled every space inside her. To be named here is not an honor, it is a burden. Are you willing? Anselma did not speak aloud. Her thoughts, raw and trembling, formed the only answer she could offer. I have already borne the fire. I will carry what remains. The red thread around her wrists tightened, not painfully, but as confirmation. The column began to turn. Stone upon stone shifted silently until a single panel, shoulder height, faced her fully. Upon it was a name, her name, Anselma, of no house fireborn, waterbound, witness. Beneath it, space remained. Empty lines waiting to be filled, not with titles, with choices. A knife emerged from the stone, smooth, ceremonial, its blade shaped like a leaf. The handle was bone, inlaid with a single black pearl. She took it, without instruction. She knew. She cut the thread. The red strands fell like blood on snow, curling slightly as they touched the floor. The knife vanished back into the column, and the silence deepened. Behind her, new footsteps echoed. Many. She turned. Dozens of veiled figures stood at the rotunda's edges, not robed in mourning this time, but in vestments of dark crimson and midnight blue, lined with silver glyphs. They bore no faces, but they bowed, and from the shadows beyond them, another figure emerged, taller, older. His robe trailed behind him like a banner of ink. His hands were gloved, and he wore no veil, only a hood drawn low. Yet even in shadow, Anselma could feel the weight of his gaze. A priest, a warden, or something older than both. He approached with slow, deliberate grace, no threat in his posture, no comfort either. "You have walked the fire," he said softly. His voice was gravel wrapped in silk. "You have tasted the river's truth. But names are not enough. To remember is not to understand, and without understanding, memory becomes madness." He extended his hand. "Come, there is one more place." Anselma hesitated, not from fear, but from fatigue. Her bones ached with the weight of it all, the fire, the descent, the thread, the names, and yet she moved. She placed her hand in his. It was warm. He led her to a new passage, narrow and sloped, where the ceiling dropped so low she had to bow her head. The torches here burned with actual flame, red gold, flickering with the restlessness of truth unburied. The scent of incense clung to the walls, myrrh, sage, and something bitter underneath, like scorched parchment. The corridor opened into a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center stood a table. Upon it, a book, not large, not ancient. Its leather cover was unmarked, but its edges frayed. A candle burned beside it, and behind it sat an empty chair. The man gestured. "This is where the fire becomes word. Sit," she obeyed. The chair sighed beneath her weight. The book exhaled dust as she opened it to the first blank page. A quill lay beside the inkpot. The man spoke again. "Tell the truth, not what happened, but what it meant." He stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Anselma dipped the quill. She wrote, "Not about the abbey's fall, not about the screams or the bell or the fire that took the last of her sisters. She wrote about the silence that came after, the emptiness, the moment when she realized her faith had not burned, only changed. She wrote of Sister Eselda's hand, trembling as it touched her cheek, not out of fear, but farewell. She wrote of the river's stillness, of the masked woman who said nothing, yet knew everything. The ink flowed like memory that had waited too long, too long. Pages filled. Each word carved a path behind her, deeper into her own past and the pasts of others who had written here. She could feel their ghosts in the room, not haunting, but watching, approving. She did not stop until the final page. There, she wrote one sentence. "To carry the forgotten is to become the flame they lost." She closed the book. The candle guttered. The chamber dimmed. The man returned. He said nothing. He only bowed. And for the first time, so did she. Then he took the book gently, like lifting a child from a grave, and placed it on a shelf. With hundreds of others, each spine unmarked, each story now remembered, if only by one. The door behind her opened, not back toward the rotunda, but upward. Stone stairs, spiraling toward air, daylight, waited. The fire, the river, the veil, the names all behind her now, but the memory walked with her. As she climbed, the wind returned. Birds above the earth sang again, and far in the distance a bell rang, not for death, not for mourning, but for return. She had gone below, and now she would bring the fire back. The fog had teeth that night. It bit into her cheeks as she stepped into the unseen, a thin blade of wind carving slow crescents into her skin. Around her, the night closed like a tomb. No sky, no stars, only the deep, gray murk of something unlit and ancient, wrapping itself around her as if it remembered her name before she was born. Anselma didn't know how long she had walked. The river no longer ran beside her. It had faded from view, swallowed by mist and root. The sound of it, too, had slipped away, replaced by something subtler, stranger. Not silence, no, silence, she knew. This was a hush that breathed. It moved when she moved. It watched. It waited. The air around her felt waterlogged with memory, as though the earth itself remembered every footstep that had passed this way and resented hers. And then footsteps, not hers, behind, paired, uneven. She stopped. The fog didn't. It curled past her as if to avoid the interruption. She turned, slowly, heart pulsing in her ears, louder than any bell, and saw nothing but that gray milk of distance. Her eyes strained. The sound was gone, but the cold on her back told her it had not been imagined. Something had walked with her, and had stopped when she did. "Come out," she said, voice low, nearly choked. "If you mean harm, let me see your face before I fall." No answer, only the soft moan of branches, the occasional drip of melting frost from unseen limbs. She walked faster. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself were thickening, turning to something other than earth. Her robes, damp and stiff with ash, snagged on bramble unseen. Her bare feet, bleeding now from the path's cruel litter slid in mud that hadn't been there minutes before. And then, as if conjured by exhaustion alone, the fog began to thin. Not much, just enough. A shadow took shape, a head tall, angular, unmoving. A structure, she thought, a gate, a ruin. No, it was too tall, too narrow. It was a bell, a solitary tower, bone-white and rotting, rose from the mire like a buried truth finally unearthed. Its stones were cracked in places, weeping moss. The bell itself large, rusted, and crucified between beams hung low, as if burdened by the weight of 1,000 unanswered prayers. No rope, no clapper, yet still it had rung. She reached it and stopped. Her breath clouded before her, every exhale a ghost. A symbol was etched into the side of the bell's supported, nearly worn smooth. A wheel of thorns, encircling a single burning eye. She had seen it once before, on the binding of a book never meant to be opened. A forbidden volume, sealed in the abbey's vault, written in ink that shimmered when no light was present. She had asked once what it meant. Mother Sira had slapped her. "You do not ask about the eye. You do not speak of the watcher." But the bell had spoken, and it had brought her here. A cold breath touched her neck, not wind, not weather. Closer than that, Anselma turned. A woman stood behind her, pale, robed, eyes like stones, at the bottom of a well, gray, unreadable, drowned. Her voice was like the strike of wet flint. "You crossed the river," Anselma's voice caught in her throat. "I was told to." "No one is told to," the woman said. "They are remembered." "That is worse." A silence bloomed between them. Then, "Are you the queen?" The woman smiled. It was not kind. She has not worn a face in centuries. "Then who are you?" "I am what you've already become." The woman raised one hand, palm open. Anselma looked down at it. In the center, not a wound, but a marca spiral that moved, not writhed, not glowed, moved, as if it were alive and dreaming. "You remember the bell," the woman said, "but not the silence before it." And then Anselma's vision broke. The abbey, a flash, a scream, her own voice begging through smoke, not for help, for forgiveness. the face of the girl who had come to her for bread, whose hair she had stroked, whose hunger she had tried to soothe, and whose name she had forgotten when the fire came. Her body curled near the chapel door, not burned, but frozen, as if the flame had run from her, and the candle, the one Anselma held when the fire started, the one lit not by match or torched but by word. "I didn't mean to," Anselma whispered, but the other woman only stared. "That never changes what it is," and with that she turned, walked away, into the fog. Anselma followed. She passed beneath the hanging bell. Its silence thundered through her chest like 100 tolls of judgment. The air grew warmer, not with sun, but with breath, as though she walked into the mouth of something enormous and patient. The ground changed again. Stone now, smooth, wide, ancient. She walked a path carved into no map. Along its edge grew no plants, only bones, small ones, long ones, shattered ones, all arranged like offerings or warnings. They reached a door, not wood, not iron, something older than metal, older than prayer, carved from the fossil of a fallen tree no one remembered the name of. The woman placed her hand against it. The mark on her palm glowed now, faint as morning light. The door opened, but not empty. The scent was first salt ash, myrrh, the perfume of places where rituals die. Then the sound, a heartbeat, slow, deep, inhuman, not hers, not the woman's. The walls inside were inscribed with prayers. Anselma could not read, yet knew. She had spoken them in her sleep as a child, had traced their curves into frost on the windows of the carpenter's hut. Her father had thought them drawings of birds. She knew better. The woman spoke again, softer now. "This place does not forgive, but it remembers, and so must you." She reached into the folds of her robe and produced a blade, not a weapon, a key, ivory hilted, etched with script. She handed it to Anselma. "You lit the fire with a word," she said. "You must find the name of what answered." Anselma's hands shook as she took it. The blade felt warm, too warm. "What if I can't?" she asked. The woman's eyes, for the first time, softened. "Then you will stay. You will stay forever." With that, the woman stepped back into the darkness and was gone. Anselma stood alone. She turned. The door had vanished. No exit, no bell, no fog. Only the path forward through black halls of memory and marrow, where names had power and guilt could bloom like flowers fed with blood. She walked, and as her foot touched the next stone, it rang, not with sound, with recognition. The wind no longer moved the trees. The fog had thickened into something with weight, not mist but memory, wrapped around every branch like mourning cloth. Anselma walked in silence, her feet numb, not from cold, but from something else, something heavier than frost, something like forgetting. Time unraveled behind her. She no longer knew how long it had been since the fire. She no longer asked if it had happened at all. Each step toward the unknown became a surrender, not to darkness, but to the kind of light that doesn't warm, the kind of light that hums behind closed eyes in a fever dream. She followed no path now. There was no path, only the strange terrain of the deep forest, where trees grew too close and too tall, and the canopy strangled the sky. Moonlight fractured through twisted limbs, pale and broken, as if the heavens were looking in through a shattered window. Moss crawled over bark like skin, reclaiming a wound, and then, suddenly, not the peace of silence, but the dread of it. Its roots jutted from the ground like ribs, forming a cage around its base. Black vines clung to the bark like veins, pulsing faintly beneath the surface. The trunk was wide enough to swallow 10 men, and at its heart, an opening, not a door, not even a hollow. Just darkness, shaped like an invitation. She should have turned away, but her breath caught held in her throat like a secret, a whisper, not in the air, but in her bones. You are not trespassing, you are returning. She stepped forward. Inside, the air was cool and dry, like the inside of a crypt. The ceiling arched like the belly of a cathedral, but made of wood, gnarled and ancient. The floor sloped downward into the earth, steps carved not by tools but time. She walked, and the world above her folded shut. The deeper she went, the more the scent changed from soil and bark to wax and incense and something else, something metallic, the smell of old coins or dried blood. And then, as she reached the base of the spiral, the walls opened into a chamber. It was not a room, it was a wound in the earth. The roots of the great tree formed pillars around her, their tips dripping amber resin that glowed faintly in the dark. In the center was a pool, black as obsidian, still as glass. Around it, candles floated in bowls of hollowed bark, their flames steady despite the lack of air. And beside the pool stood a woman. She wore a robe the color of storm water, her hair woven with bone beads. Her face was lined not with age, but with stories, set like carvings in stone. She did not look at Anselma. She looked into the pool, and the pool looked back. You are late, she said, without anger. But the river knew. The tree knew. You bled into their mouths, and they carried you here. Anselma opened her lips to speak, but no sound came. The woman turned now. Her eyes were pale, not white, but the soft gray of ash that still holds heat. Her gaze was not unkind, but it saw through. You were told to come, and you came. That is enough. Anselma found her voice. What is this place? The woman walked to her, bare feet silent on the stone. This is the place before names, before vows, before fire. This is the mouth of memory, and it opens only for those who have nothing left to forget. She reached out and touched Anselma's chest, above the heart. You are empty now. That is good. Vessels must be emptied before they can be filled. I don't want to be filled, Anselma whispered. I just want to rest. The woman smiled, but it was the smile of someone who knows how cruel wishes can be. There is no rest, not for the marked, not for the ones who survive when they were meant to perish. Anselma flinched. I didn't survive. I fled. No, the woman said, her voice now low and echoing. You carried the last light of the abbey in your hands. And when you let go, the flame didn't die. It changed. It changed you. She stepped aside and gestured to the pool. Look, Anselma obeyed. In the water, her reflection did not move with her. It stood still, eyes open wide, robes soaked with smoke. Her hair was white now, not from age, but from ash. Her skin glowed faintly, as if lit from within. The figure in the water opened its mouth and sang not a song, but a note. One long, low note that rang in her ribs. She gasped and staggered. Back! What am I? She cried. The woman spoke gently now, as one would to a grieving child. You are what remains, and what remains is always changed. The candles flickered. The resin dripped faster. A low hum rose from the earth beneath them. You must go deeper, said the woman. This place is only the threshold. You must go beneath the pool. And Selma stared at the black water. I'll drown. No, the woman replied. You will remember. But I don't want to remember. And yet you came. The woman raised her hand. From the shadows behind the roots came others' figures, cloaked in silence, their faces hidden. They carried a stone basin between them, filled with silver dust. One of them reached into it and smeared the dust across Anselma's eyes. It was cold, then hot, then gone. The world tilted. She stepped into the pool. The water embraced her like a mother knot, kind but possessive. It pulled her under, not with violence, but inevitability. Darkness bloomed. She did not fight. She did not breathe. And then a scream, not hers, not human. The scream of something ancient and broken. It echoed through the water like thunder in a sealed crypt. The scream became a vision. She saw the Abbot as it burned, but before the plague, before the rot, before the fear, she saw the other sisters laughing in the orchard. She saw the nun who'd touched her face before the fire, singing lullabies to bees. She saw herself kneeling in the chapel, and the candle, and the smoke, and then she saw the fire begin, not from a torch, not from lightning, from a man in the robes of a priest, a man whose face she knew, her father. The vision shattered. She screamed. This time it was her voice, ripped raw from her throat beneath the water. She kicked, clawed, rose air. She broke the surface, gasping. She was not in the pool. She was lying on damp stone in a corridor she had never seen. The woman was gone. The candles were gone. The tree above had vanished. In their place, walls of carved bone, roots pressed like veins through skulls, and torches that burned with green flame. She was deeper now, beneath memory, beneath truth. She stood. Her legs were weak. Her heart was louder than the silence. A voice called from down the corridor. Not a voice. A whisper made of every voice she'd ever loved. She followed. What else was there to do? As she walked, the walls began to speak not in words, but in fragments of song, sobbing, laughter, prayers. They crawled into her ears and nested there. She walked past doors with no handles, behind each a different version of her. One weeping, one praying, one asleep. She walked faster. At last, she came to a chamber, lit only by a circle of mirrors. In the center stood a basin, and in it, the candle, the one she had held that night, still lit, still flickering. She stepped forward, and the mirrors lit up. Each reflected her, but not the same. One was a child, covered in sawdust, her father singing. One was a nun, kneeling, bleeding. One was a woman in armor, her eyes gold with fire. She turned away, but the candle hissed. She reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the flame, the mirrors shattered. The chamber went black, and in the black, a single voice, "You are ready." She fell, not down, but inward, into something waiting, something that had been calling her, not for days, but for centuries. The fog did not lift that morning. It curled like smoke around her shoulders and wound its way into her lungs, soft and persistent. The trees that surrounded her were not trees at all. They were specters in bark, arms bent as if in mourning, each one leaning not toward the sun, but inward, as though whispering secrets to the orchard's heart. And Selma stepped carefully. The ground beneath her was thick with rotting apples, their skins blistered, their flesh bleeding ferment into the soil. The scent was sweet, too sweet. It clung to her robes and hair, the way incense once clung to the chapel rafters, before fire replaced benediction. There had been no road here, only the path shaped by her own doubt, her own weight. The bell from the river had vanished, swallowed by miles of quiet. Now there was only the soft sound of fruit bursting underfoot, and the echo of a name she no longer recognized as her own. She did not ask who had planted the orchard. She did not wonder who had abandoned it. The silence told her all she needed. This was a place of memory, not life, of things that once fed the soul and now fed the roots. She knelt by a tree with bark like cracked bone and reached for a single apple that had not yet fallen. It was pale, nearly white, with a faint pink blush like the cheek of a fevered child. When she touched it, the stem broke easily, as though the tree had been waiting to surrender. She bit, and the orchard exhaled, not with wind, not with sound, but with memory. She saw it all at once, like glass shattering inward, children running barefoot through rows of saplings, a woman in a brown cloak collecting herbs in the dusk, her eyes sharp, her movements practiced, a man with ink-stained fingers carving prayers into wooden slats and hanging them like charms from the branches. Then the soldier's boots heavy, fire in hand, not to conquer, but to erase. She saw the orchard burn, the smoke climb, the trees scream without voices. And then the woman again, her mouth moving in a vow, her hands pressing something into the soil, something that shimmered like oil on water, then darkness. And on Selma, on her knees, the apple in her palm, now split and oozing, the vision left her trembling, not because of fear, but because of recognition. The orchard was not cursed, it was remembering, and she, for reasons she could not name, had been allowed to witness its grief. She stood, slow and reverent, and continued deeper, following the unspoken pull that had guided her since the abbey fell. The trees began to change. Their fruit disappeared. Their limbs thickened, bark darkened. The air cooled. The path narrowed until it was barely wide enough for her feet. Roots coiled like serpents in the soil, daring her to trip, to fall, to turn back. But she did not, and when she emerged, it was not to open sky, but to stone, a ruin, old, older than any abbey. Columns broken like ribs, moss thick along the walls, as if time had tried to cover its shame. In the center, a basin dry, but not empty. In its hollow sat a single feather, white as frost, and longer than any bird she knew. It glowed faintly, though no light touched it. Anselma approached. She did not ask why her hands reached for it. She did not speak. She only knew that the feather was not meant to remain untouched. The moment she lifted it, the wind screamed, not around her, inside her. It carried voices, dozens, hundreds, weeping, laughing, praying. It lifted her robes like wings. Her eyes shut against the pressure, against the ache blooming behind her ribs. And then it stopped, just as suddenly, and everything was still again. She looked down. The feather was gone, but in her hand remained a mark, a faint circle with a cross through its center, like the sigil once carved above the chapel door. She did not feel pain. She felt awake. Behind her, a door opened, not one built of wood or iron, but of light, emerging from the ruin's wall, shaped by flame and shadow. She stepped through, and the world shifted. The orchard vanished. The cold vanished. She stood in a hall lined with fireflies, hundreds of them, hovering mid-air, like stars lost on their way to the sky. The floor was water. She walked and left no ripples. The walls were woven of memories, scenes flickering faintly, endlessly. A mother burying her child in snow, a knight weeping beneath his banner, a baker carving runes into loaves for protection. She realized this was no place. It was memory itself. She was inside the act of remembering a vessel for what could not be forgotten. And at the hall's end, waiting in silence, sat the woman from the orchard. The herb gatherer. Her cloak was the color of storm clouds. Her face was not old, yet carried age. Not young, but shaped by youth. Her hands rested on her knees, palms upward, as if she too waited to be read like scripture. "You are late," the woman said, and Selma's voice cracked as she answered, "I didn't know I was expected." "You were, long before the abbey, long before the fire, before you were born into wood and wool. Your name was written in the wind." And Selma wanted to weep, but there were no tears left, only the throb of her mark and the pulse of the halls. "Breath, what am I?" she asked. "Why me?" The woman did not smile, but her eyes softened. "You are the bridge between what was and what remains. You carry the smoke and the silence. You are not the first, but you are the first in a long, long time." And then she stood, and the hall darkened. The fireflies dimmed. One by one, the walls unraveled into shadow. Only the woman remained, and her voice. "Go now," she said. "The past has remembered you. Now you must remember the future." Anselma blinked, and found herself at the river again. Rian's spine. But it was no longer dusk, it was dawn. Mist rose from the surface like incense, and from across the water, a figure approached, cloaked, slow, bearing a lantern that did not flicker. And Selma stood tall, not as a nun, not as a girl, but as something new. The mark on her hand glowed faintly as the figure reached the shore. And in that silent moment, where wind touched water, where past touched future, Anselma stepped forward, not to run, not to flee, but to become. The snow came soundless, like ash descending over a battlefield long since abandoned. No wind announced its arrival, no cloud heralded its fall. It drifted down through the naked branches like forgotten blessings, resting on Anselma's shoulders, her hair, the ridges of her knuckles, turning her into a relic before her time. She stood at the river's edge, where the water had once flowed like oil over black stone, but now it had frozen in strange geometry, spiraling not with the logic of wind or cold, but in the sigil-like patterns of something ancient, something watching. Anselma did not move. She had not moved for hours. Beneath her bare feet, the frost bit deep, but it did not claim her. The pain had passed beyond sensation, transformed into something more ritualistic like penance. Her eyes, glassy and dry, stared across the river to where the bell had tolled. No village rose in the distance, no steeple, no path carved through the forest. Only the lingering memory of sound and the pale blue glimmer of ice reflecting moonlight like the eye of a half-buried god. She had dreamt the bell again, not as a warning, but as a summons. And this time, in her dream, she had seen the one who rang it. He wore the skin of a man, but moved like fog over a plague cart silently, impossibly. A face both young and ancient, eyes milk-white like seer stones, cracked from riverbeds. He had spoken without lips moving, his voice echoing not through her. ears but her bones. Cross, the veil is thinnest beneath the ice. Now, as the dawn limped over the horizon, weak and colorless as a dying breath, Selma lowered her gaze to the river's surface. She had crossed many thresholds in silence. Doorways of flame, corridors of stone, fields soaked with holy blood. But none had frightened her like this. She stepped forward. The ice did not creak. It did not warn her. It received her like a host receives the sacrificial blade, with calm and with purpose. With each step, the silence grew louder. Beneath her, the patterns in the ice shifted. Spirals closed and reopened like gills, circles linked into chains. She no longer looked down for balance, she looked down for answers. And in the fifth spiral, she saw a face. It was not hers. It was Sister Briona, the one who had placed the candle in Anselma's hand the night of the fire, whispering only, "Run to the river, find the bell. Remember who you were before the cloth." Briona's face beneath the ice did not move, but her eyes were wide, aware, pleading. Her mouth, though sealed in frost, looked like it had frozen mid-prayer. Anselma dropped to her knees. Her breath fogged the ice, clouding Briona's face, and when the fog lifted, the face was gone. In its place was water, clear, undisturbed, and deep. Anselma pressed her palm to the surface. The cold pulsed up her arm like a wound opening in reverse. Somewhere in the marrow of her memory, she remembered the tale of Rian, the queen who drowned herself rather than surrender to the invaders. They said her spirit still slept in the river's darkest fold, and that every winter the veil between her world and theirs thinned until only ice remained. That she sang to women who had lost their names, that she offered them a choice, to remember or to vanish. Anselma stood again. The center of the river widened into a perfect circle, darker than the rest, as if it were less frozen than waiting. The patterns on the ice had coiled inward like the petals of a night flower folding to protect its secrets. There, at the center, the bell, not a dream, not a memory, a real iron bell, blackened with age, fused to the frozen river like a relic. In a shrine, no rope, no rust. It looked untouched by time, but untouched by worship as well, something sacred, forgotten by choice. She reached it just as the sky began to bleed pale gold. Her hand hovered above the bell, trembling. A voice came then, not a whisper, not a call, a song, no words, just a note, long and low, rising from beneath the ice, like breath from the lungs of the earth. It was not music, it was memory shaped into sound. And as Anselma listened, she began to cry, not from sorrow, but from recognition. She remembered her mother's lullabies, the scent of cedar in her father's workshop, the first time her name was spoken, in kindness, not command. Anselma. The bell began to vibrate, not from wind, not from force, but from her presence. The note changed, rose higher, split, became a harmony. Another voice joined, then another. Soon the river was a choir. Each voice was a woman. Each woman had once stood where she now stood, and each had chosen. Anselma closed her eyes and struck the bell. It did not ring. It shattered, not into shards, but into snow, black, soft, falling upward. The ice beneath her feet did not break. It melted in a perfect circle around her, lowering her gently, like a cradle descending into sleep. The river opened, and Anselma sank without fear. Below the ice there was no cold, only silence, and a strange light that flickered like stained glass underwater. Her robes floated like wings, her hair unfurled behind her like threads of prophecy. She descended past fish frozen in prayer, past bones arranged in deliberate symbols, past roots that pulsed with memory, and finally she saw her. Rian the queen did not wear a crown, nor did she sit on any throne. She floated in a cathedral of ice, her arms open, her face serene. Her dress was made of river reeds and sorrow. Her eyes, when they opened, saw straight through time. Anselma hovered before her, heart slowing. Rian spoke not with lips, but with knowing. You have come through fire, and you have not turned to ash. You have come through silence, and you have not forgotten your name. What do you seek, daughter of no one? Anselma did not speak aloud, but the answer surged from within her like light from a wound. To remember who I was before I belonged to others. To become whole without the names given to me by flames or veils. To return not to the world, but to myself. Rian's smile was not joy, but permission. She extended a single hand, and from her palm a thread of light emerged, spun from ice and blood and time. Anselma reached for it, and the moment her fingers touched that light, the river above them began to shift. Ice cracked not violently, but reverently. Like stained glass breaking to make room for sky, the choir rose again, louder now, filled with names, not prayers. Briona, Elira, Soraha, Selan, Mevin, and Selma. The river closed behind them, but not in silence. In song, and as Anselma rose, the ice resealed, the bell was gone, the fog returned, and on the bank of the river, where no bridges stood, a figure emerged barefoot, robed in dew and memory, her eyes filled with stars not yet mapped. She was no longer nun, no longer daughter, no longer a vessel for someone else's will. She was Anselma, and the river had remembered her. As she walked into the forest beyond the veil, snow began to fall, again soft, upward. Somewhere in the distance, a new bell rang. But it was not a summons, it was a beginning. There is a kind of silence that does not sleep, it broods. When the winds faded and the forest thinned, Anselma entered the marshland. It was not marked on any map, for it obeyed no border and answered no master. The ground breathed under her feet, water swelling between moss-laced roots like the heaving lungs of a beast at rest. Mist clung to her ankles like dead children begging not to be forgotten. Somewhere in the fog, a heron screamed. Then all was still again. It had been 3 nights since she crossed Rian's spine. 3 nights since the bell rang from the ghost village. She had not seen another soul. The bread was gone. The fever came and went in waves, leaving her trembling and slick with sweat. Mumbling prayers she did not remember learning. Her body, once a vessel for vows, now moved like a wounded thing, stubborn, slow, and mutinous. And yet she walked. The marsh whispered to itself in languages older than sound. Frogs blinked with ancient patience from beneath lily shadows. Reeds bowed in reverence as she passed. Her robe, once white, now bore the bruises of the land, claret at the hem, stitched with thorns, a halo of gnats circling her shoulders like false saints. She carried no weapon, no relic, only a broken string of beads and a name she no longer trusted. Anselma. What good was a name when fire could erase it in a breath? She came upon the lantern in the hour before dawn. It hung alone on a crooked post of driftwood, half buried in the muck, its light impossibly steady. Around it, the reeds bent away, forming a clearing in the shape of a circle, too perfect to be natural. She approached slowly, her every footstep swallowed by the mud with a soft, sucking groan. The flame did not flicker. There was no wind, no breath, only that light, pale gold, too warm for this world, glowing like a memory trying to return. When she reached the post, she did not touch the lantern. She bowed, not out of faith, but out of instinct. Behind her, something moved. She did not turn. The marsh had rules. She remembered them now, not from books, not from the convent, but from somewhere before, the lullabies her mother sang when she was sick, when the fever brought visions of eyes in the reeds and hands under the floorboards. Never look when it moves behind you. Never speak when it breathes in your ear. And if you see the lantern, kneel. The thing behind her exhaled, not with lungs, but like 1,000 moths beating their wings at once. Her skin prickled, her vision narrowed. Still, she bowed. Then, as suddenly as it came, the presence was gone. The lantern dimmed, then flared, and then, like a wound healing shut, it blinked out. Darkness returned, like a memory, slow, heavy, unwelcome. She remained kneeling. Her knees sank deeper into the mud, cold, seeping up her bones like creeping frost. Time passed sideways here, minutes folded into hours, and then a sound, soft, regular, wet footsteps, not hers, coming from behind. She stood, slowly, her hands clenched into fists, no longer praying, no longer hiding. From the fog emerged a boy, no older than 10, hair matted with brambles, eyes too large for his face, skin the color of ash and bruised fruit. He held nothing, said nothing, just looked at her. Her voice, when it came, cracked like frozen bark. "Who are you?" The boy blinked, then pointed, not at her, not at the marsh, but at the place where the lantern had been. It was there again, burning, floating, moving, drifting deeper into the fog. She looked back at the boy, but he was gone, so she followed. The path was not a path. It twisted without logic, doubled back on itself, split into mirrored corridors of fog and root. The lantern always stayed just ahead, never fast, never far, always visible. It led her to a clearing of drowned trees, their trunks petrified in death, gray as bone, branches like pleading arms. Beneath them, shallow water shimmered with a film of oil, rainbow-hued and sickly. Frogs watched from their thrones of rot. Insects hung like fruit from cobweb branches. She stepped forward. The lantern bobbed over a submerged behind a curtain of vines. She hesitated, then pushed through and found the door. It was carved into the side of a tree, wider than a tower, a black arch in the bark, rimmed with symbols etched in wax and bone. No hinges, no handle, just an opening, waiting. Inside, warmth, not fire, not light, memory. She entered. The tree was hollow, but it did not end. Stairs spiraled downward, carved of stone and root, each step wrapped in moss and candle drippings. The air grew thick, sweet with the scent of myrrh and damp velvet. Her breath echoed, paintings lined the walls, not of saints, but of faces twisted in grief, eyes scratched out, mouths sewn shut. She passed them without pausing. At the base of the stairs was a chamber, circular, silent, sacred. The floor was covered in robes, nuns' habits, monks' cloaks, pilgrims' veils, all discarded like shed skins, some still stained with blood, some still warm. At the center of the room, the lantern floated. Beneath it, a pool, black, still, deep, beyond reason. Her reflection stared up at her, but it was not hers. The woman in the water wore her face, but older, paler, eyes rimmed with salt, a crown of thorns on her brow. And Selma stepped closer. The lantern pulsed. The pool rippled. A voice spoke, not aloud, not in her mind, but through the bones in her legs and the ache in her back and the memory in her lungs. You are not the first. She fell to her knees. Please, she whispered, though she did not know to whom. You came for fire. You stayed for water. The pool shimmered. Do you remember what you asked? She shook her head. Then listen. And the water rose. It did not splash. It did not spill. It climbed slowly, like a column of glass, until it stood before her, tall as a man, wide as a tombstone. Within it, faces hundreds. Some she recognized. The abbess, the carpenter, the boy from the marsh, her own mother, weeping blood. Each spoke a single word. Together, choose. She reached out, touched the water, and it shattered. When she awoke, she was on dry ground. No marsh, no tree, no lantern, just stars, cold, vast, indifferent. The moon stared down like an eye with no pupil. She sat up. Her robe was dry. Her hands were stained black, as if dipped in ink. Her rosary was whole again, but each bead now bore a different name, carved in a language she had never seen. She was not alone. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing, each cloaked, each faceless. One held a candle. One held a rope. One held a book bound in skin. She rose. They did not move. Then the one with the book stepped forward, handed it to her. Inside, blank pages, except one. Her name, on Selma, followed by one word, witness. She closed the book, and the marsh sang. The next morning, she would find a village that should not have been there, a place where time had broken, where the dead walked backwards and bells tolled for the living. But that was still to come. Tonight, she would sleep beside the roots of a tree that did not remember its name. Above her, a lantern would hang, and in its light, shadows would dance the story of what she had become. Not saint, not sinner, but the seam between, the keeper of the marsh, the one who looked back, the one who stayed. The fog did not lift. It thickens low and bone-colored, coiling through the trees like something breathing against her skin. Every branch dripped with frost. Every root seemed to shift beneath her step. The silence was no longer a stillness, but a pressure, as if the world held its breath around her, waiting for her to speak or stumble. And Selma did neither. She walked. The path had long since vanished. There was only moss now, slick and veined with filaments that glowed faintly, as though the forest had veins of its own. Each step hummed beneath her feet, a music she could not hear, but which her bones understood. It reminded her of the chants sung at dusk in the nave, when voices blurred into echoes and candlelight licked the stone walls like fire-seeking prayer. But this was not the abbey. This was the land beneath the land, the place the sisters had spoken of only once, during a winter blizzard so fierce they believed death sat outside the walls in a black cloak. There is a gate, Sister Mare had whispered by the hearth, but it is not made of wood or iron. It is made of memory, and it opens only when everything behind you has turned to ash. Now, and Selma knew what she meant, because ahead, just beyond the frost-gloved trees, There was a shape, a structure, buried in mist and vine, not built, grown, curved like a shell, but vast as a chapel overturned. It shimmered with damp light, as if it breathed through the fog, exhaling centuries with every groan of its roots. And something inside was singing, not a hymn, not a voice, but something older, like wind caught in a flute made of bone. It rose and fell in the hollows of the strange temple like the tide kissing forgotten shores. Anselma's hands itched, not with fear, with recognition. She stepped forward, and the trees bent back, not broken, not cracked, but bowed like figures. In prayer, the moss beneath her grew warmer. The air pulsed with a sweetness that stung her nose. She had entered something sacred, but not holy. The doorway gaped without hinges, a mouth of vines and shadow. She ducked beneath it, and the moment she crossed, sound returned. A single note, long, drawn like a bow across a string. It echoed against the walls, were not walls, but woven roots, hardened like stone. Light pooled from nowhere, glimmering across the floor in shapes that twisted like runes. The air tasted of loam and rain, and in the center of the space, rising from the ground like a sunken relic, was a lantern. It burned blue, but not with flame. It pulsed, as if alive, as if waiting. Anselma approached, and the moment her hand hovered above it, the light blinked one sand. She fell without falling. The air vanished, the roots unspooled, and the world became water, but not cold, not violent. It was warm, embracing, as if some ancient lake had risen up to cradle her in its forgotten belly. Her lungs did not burn, her limbs did not thrash. She was held, weightless, rootless. Vision dissolved into shadow, and sound melted into vibration. And then, slowly like sunlight pouring through an old stained glass, something began to return. Not her body, her mind. She saw the abbey not burning, but blooming. Stone turned to vines, bells turned to birds. Nuns danced barefoot across the halls, their habits spun of silk and mist. Sister Myrrh sang with a voice made of wind and starlight. The old altar bled light instead of wine, and her own reflection shimmered in every window. But she was not Ensma. She was a child, then a woman, then a tree, then dust, then a flicker, and through it all, one shape remained, the lantern, still pulsing blue, still calling, until the image shattered. And she stood again in dry ground, but not the same ground. The structure was gone. No dome, no roots, no mist, only a circle of stones around her feet, blackened by age, and carved with marks she had no name for. The forest no longer sang, the moss no longer glowed, and she was not alone. Across from her stood a man, tall, hooded, motionless. His robes were simple, dark as dried blood. His hands were clasped, not in menace, but in mourning. His face, when she finally dared to look, was lined, not by age, but by remembering. "You carry the fire," he said. Anselma did not answer. "Not the fire that burns wood," he continued. "The fire that survives it." Still, she said nothing. He took a step forward, and the ground did not crunch or stir. He left no mark. "Do you know what they did, those who came before?" he asked. "Built walls around the truth, called them temples, called them kingdoms. But the truth does not stay behind stone." And Selma's fingers curled. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The man tilted his head to remember, and suddenly the ground beneath them pulsed with light just once, and in that single burst memory rushed back. She was 3, holding her father's hand by the riverbank. She was 11, watching the plague cart rattle past the orchard. She was 15, in the novice's cell, clutching her rosary until her palms bled. She was 18, burying Sister Myrrh beneath the oldest yew. She was burning, but not screaming. She was walking through Mistaward, this moment. "I don't know who I am anymore," she breathed. "You're not meant to," said the man. "Not here." She looked around. The circle of stones was beginning to hum like a choir waking in the dark. Light seeped from their cracks. "What is this place?" "The seam," he said. "Between the world you left and the one that remembers is this, death." He almost smiled. "Not yet, but it is where death sleeps and dreams." And then the trees moved, not just rustled. They moved. Roots twisted, trunks leaned, branches pointed not away, but toward something deeper. Anselma turned. There was a path now, faint but unmistakable, etched in frost and golden light. It led down, always down, into the folds of earth where no sun had touched for 1,000 years. "Will I return?" she asked, to what the man said. "The ashes. I don't want to be forgotten." "You were not sent here to be remembered," he said, stepping back into the mist. "You were sent here to remember." And with that, he vanished. And Selma stood at the edge of the path. The frost kissed her ankles. The blue lantern flickered, a fire that did not consume, only revealed. She stepped forward. The light did not brighten, the shadows did not part, but the earth beneath her grew softer, like memory returning to soil. And above her, from a branch she did not see, a single silver bell rang once, and silence followed it, heavy as prophecy. The next passage would not be walked with feet. It would be walked with what remained of her soul. And as Anselma descended barefoot, a girl who had once prayed and burned, she began to hum the tune she heard inside her chest, the tune of the abbey, the tune of the forest, the tune of the gate made not of iron, but of memory. And below, far below, something listened and remembered her name. The storm had passed, but it had not left quietly. Dawn arrived without color. The sky, veiled in an ashen curtain, offered no warmth, no promise. The light that spilled across the riverbank was the kind that revealed wounds, rather than healing them, than spectral, the hue of unburied secrets. Anselma stood at the edge of that pale world, her cloak heavy with dew and silence. Behind her, the trees whispered only to themselves, as if unwilling to call her one of their own. She had not slept, not truly. Her eyes had closed, her breath had slowed, but what drifted through her was not rest, it was remembrance. It was the weight of centuries breathing through her skin. She had dreamt of things not hers, of boats pulled under by vines that wept, of children born with branch-like hands, of a choir humming from beneath the soil, unseen yet near, and above all, the bell, always the bell. Its toll no longer rang from above, but below, the forest thinned reluctantly, revealing what lay beyond the veil of birch and bone. There, like a wound in the land, stretched a glade of dead heather, trampled and twisted into shapes no wind could claim. At its center, a stone gate, not built but grown. Roots had shaped it. Symbols were carved into its curve, not in any known tongue, but in rhythm, in repetition, in grief. Anselma stepped forward. The earth beneath her boots gave a soft, living sigh, as though waking to her presence. She pressed her fingers against the rootstone. It was warm, not in the way sun warms, but in the way skin remembers heat after it has died. She passed beneath the arch without speaking. Something passed through her as she did an exhale not her own. On the other side, the world was not the same. The colors shifted, subtly wrong. Greens, too deep. Shadows, too slow. The birds here did not sing, they echoed. Each cry was a memory of a cry, distorted and looped, like a prayer muttered by a mourner who no longer believed. Ahead, a hollow tree stood like a sentinel, its bark peeled back in thin scrolls, revealing a dark, honeycombed interior. On its trunk hung a garland black feathers, strung with copper wire and bits of bone, not bird bone, human. She was not alone. A woman stood beneath the tree, cloaked in crimson wool, her face shadowed by a veil of mothwing fabric. Around her neck hung a key the size of a child's rib. She did not speak, she did not need to, and Selma felt her presence like one feels a fever slow, dangerous, intimate. The woman raised her hand, not in greeting, but in warning, and then, slowly, she began to hum. The melody was not beautiful, it was raw, cracked. It sounded like something torn from a throat that had not sung in 100 years, but within it lay the shape of an old lullaby one, and Selma half remembered from her first days at the Abbey. A song about fireflies and sisters, and a door in the earth that only opened when you sang it closed. As the final note faded, the ground trembled. Behind the hollow tree, the earth split, not with violence, but like a breath long held. A stairway, spiraling downward into the dark, revealed itself. The woman pointed, and Selma did not ask why. She descended. The air below was thick with memory, not dust, not rot, but memory sharp and bitter, like the taste of ink on a forgotten page. Each step echoed not just in the chamber, but inside her ribs, as though her bones were chiming in. Answer. Torches lined the spiral, but none were lit. Still, she saw. The light came not from flame, but from veins in the walls pulsing silver blue, like the glow of moonlit water through cracked glass. At the bottom, the corridor opened into a chamber shaped like a chalice. Dozens stood there, cloaked figures, in silence. Their faces were not hidden, but their eyes were shut not in blindness, but in prayer. Some wept, others mouthed words that made no sound. In the center, a pool reflected nothing, not the ceiling, not the torches, not her. The veiled woman reappeared, as if the earth had carried her downward on its own back. She stood at the pool's edge and sang once more. This time, her voice fractured. The notes bent like heat shimmer. The pool responded. Ripples bloomed. Images surfaced. Selma saw the Abbey again, not in flames, in snow. She saw herself not as she was, but younger, hungrier, full of the ache of becoming. She watched the sisters gather around her, eyes full of sorrow they refused to name. She remembered now. They had always known this day would come, that the Abbey was never a refuge, but a waiting place. The pool showed more. A girl, hands bound, being offered to the river. A childless queen, tearing pages from her own scripture to build a raft. A carpenter, carving a cross, not for crucifixion, but for passage. The stories were not separate. They were one, and Selma was the seam between them. A sound, Rosa, distant, keening, low and layered. The figures in the chamber began to sway, and Selma felt the air tighten, then bend, then crack. A wind swept through the underground like breath through a throat. Then a door opened in the stone, not a door of wood, not even of metal, a door of shadow. Inside, nothing moved, yet everything waited. The veiled woman placed the rib key on Selma's hand. Her touch was impossibly cold. "You are not the first," she said. Her voice was not her own. It was made of many voices stacked like stones, old, childlike, broken, hopeful. "But you may be the last." Anselma stepped through the door. The chamber vanished. She stood now in a corridor of roots, living, twitching, whispering to one another. They pulled back for her, clearing her path like servants in a cathedral of blood. At the end of the corridor, a single chair waited, not a throne, not a seat of judgment, a chair carved from the stump of a once great triodes, rings forming the shape of an eye, forever watching. And Selma sat, and the walls began to hum. Voices swarmed, some from the order, others from older places. The drowned queen, woman, the sisters lost in the fire. And from among them, a child's voice, small, hers. "I remember," it said. The root chair responded, its arms folding gently around her like vines finding stone. And Anselma understood. She had not been sent to escape. She had been sent to return memory to a place that had forgotten. To sing the song the river refused to teach. To sew together the torn stories of a world that had buried its own tongue. Her body dissolved into breath, her breath into wind, her wind into story. And the roots remembered her name, Anselma. The trees leaned inward, as if to listen. They formed a corridor of crooked spines and skeletal arms, their barks split and peeling like old wounds. Anselma stepped beneath them, the sound of her breath swallowed by the moss beneath her feet. The river no longer murmured behind her. It had fallen silent the moment she crossed its threshold, as if unwilling to follow her further. Even the mist seemed reluctant to drift here, as if some older fear clung to the branches, something not spoken of since the first stones of the world were placed. The forest of forgotten names, the villagers once called it, not because it lacked them but because it kept them. Every tree, they whispered, had once been a man who refused to forget, a priest who hid relics during the burning, a wife who would not betray her husband's hiding place, a child who died holding the name of his sister behind his teeth. And so the forest remembered them, not in graves or markers, but in twisted forms and curling bark, in roots that curled like fingers reaching up from beneath the soil. Anselma had no fire to warm her, no bread to fill her, but she carried the one thing the forest did not yet own, a question, not of where to go, but of who she was now. She passed a willow whose bark had been carved into the face of a woman, eyes closed, lips parted, the suggestion of a scream frozen mid-sentence. Vines hung like undone hair from its crown, brushing on Selma's shoulders as she walked beneath them. She whispered nothing. She had nothing left to whisper. And the forest respected silence. Here, silence was not absence, it was treaty. A raven followed her for a while, not above, but beside, hopping branch to branch with uncanny precision. Its feathers were not black, but the deep indigo of storm glass, and its Aja, single milky orb, watched her like a judge. It cawed once, sharp as a blade drawn in the dark. Then it fell quiet, hopping no more. Instead, it flew ahead, and on Selma followed. For hours, maybe days, maybe minutes, for time in the forest unraveled like wet thread she walked, until the light through the canopy thinned to a copper green, and her legs began to feel as though they belonged to someone else. The raven led her to a clearing. There, in the center, stood a single tree taller than the rest, dead in color but not in form. Its bark was the gray of storm-battered cliffs. Its limbs, bare of leaves, reached upward like an old monk's arms at vespers. Around its base, the earth had been cleared in a perfect circle, swept clean of leaf or bone or moss. Nothing grew within the circle, not even rot, but something waited. A woman, not young, not old, her back straight as the tree, her hair white as cobwebs, braided with bits of bark and thorn. Her robe was not of wool or linen, but of something coarser-like, woven reeds, damp and dark. She turned to Anselma without surprise, as if she'd been expecting her since the forest was young. "You have crossed the river," she said. Her voice was the sound of wind in dry grass, not threatening, but not soft, just present. Anselma nodded. There was no other way. "There never is," the woman replied. The raven settled on the woman's shoulder, its milky eye now glinting gold. The woman lifted one gnarled hand and stroked its back. "This tree," the woman continued, "is the heartwood. It was the first tree to grow after the queen drowned. They say her soul did not return to the earth or the heavens, but into this bark. It is why no flame touches it, why no axe can fell it, why no grave grows near it." And Selma stared at the tree. There was something hollow in her chests, something echoing. "What do you want of me?" she asked. The woman tilted her head, amused. "That's not the question. Then what is? What did the fire leave you with?" Anselma stepped into the circle, and the answer came without words. It left her with the truth. She had not fled the fire to survive. She had walked into the forest not to escape, but to remember. She had been Sister Anselma, and before that, the carpenter's daughter. But the fire had not burned her past it, had scorched away everything that had been built on top of it. The prayers, the veils, the silence. What remained was something deeper, not faith, not rebellion, calling. The woman watched her. "You remember now." Anselma met her eyes. "I remember what they took. Good. Then you may go to the hollow, where the other ones wait. Others like me. No, others you were meant to lead." A breath caught in Anselma's throat. The woman reached behind the tree and pulled out a long staff, carved with spirals and runes and symbols so old their meaning had long since dissolved into intuition. "You were not meant for the abbey, child. You were meant for the ruin beneath it." She placed the staff in Anselma's hands. The moment she touched it, the forest exhaled. Wind rustled the branches. The birds called once more. Even the moss grew greener. The woman stepped back into the shadows. "You will find the hollow when the moon cracks," she said, "and not before." Then she was gone, as if she had never been. And Anselma stood alone beneath the heartwood, the staff warm in her hand, her heart no longer silent. She did not know where the hollow was, but she knew what it would ask of her, and she knew she would say yes. She turned, and the raven flew again, circling her once before vanishing into the trees. No path revealed itself, no light guided her steps, but her feet moved, sure, now. The forest of forgotten names did not keep her. It remembered her, and it let her go. The night had no stars, only the pulse of something deeper, older than darkness, stirred in the belly of the land, as if the earth itself had closed its eyes and begun to dream again. But not of men, not of light. It dreamed of bones, of blood, of vows spoken in languages the mouth was never meant to utter. Beneath the tangled canopy of blackthorn and stone oak, Anselma walked in silence, her shadow long and brittle beside her, her breath trailing like prayer smoke through the forest's broken ribs. She had not eaten since the river. The honey-sweet sickness still curdled behind her teeth, and her stomach rebelled at the mere thought of food. But it was not hunger that pressed on her now. It was memory, reshaped, refracted, returning in strange pieces. Her mother's singing at dusk, her father's hands rough but always kind, the linen veil brushed against her cheek in the chapel's last moments, fingers tightening on her wrist. "Go to the altar of bone," the last nun whispered. And here it was, not a structure, not a ruin, but a wound in the forest floor, circular, deliberate. The trees bent away from it, roots recoiling like serpents, moss refusing to grow on its edge. In the center, the bones, hundreds of them, femur, rib, jaw, vertebra, cleaned and placed with reverence in a spiraling pattern, forming an altar untouched by time or beast. No animal came here. Even the wind was hesitant, and knees buckled as she approached, not from weakness, but recognition, the way one recognizes a scent from childhood or a voice long buried in snow. She sank onto the earth, hands trembling against the stones that rimmed the spiral. They were warm. From somewhere deep below, she heard it, not a voice, not quite, but an echo, a memory of speech, drifting upward through marrow and loam. "You were not the first." Her throat closed, not with fear, with understanding. "You will not be the last." The bones did not move, and yet they shimmered with life unspent, a potential coiled like a spring beneath centuries of silence. She traced the spiral with her finger, and the moment she reached its center, a pulse of air, cold and scented with myrrh, passed over her shoulders. Behind her, a man stood. He was not clothed. His skin bore the same pallor as the altar, white stained with time, tattooed with marks from another age. His eyes, though, were fire, not metaphor, not symbol, fire, living flame that blinked and breathed within the sockets. And yet, she was not afraid. He knelt beside her, folding his body with the patience of stone. His voice, when it came, was soft enough to wither grass. "You carry the last bell." And Selma touched the pouch. At her side, she had forgotten it was there. Inside, a sliver of brass, what remained of the abbey's bell, shattered in the fire. She had clutched it in the smoke without thought. Now it hummed against her palm. "Why me?" she asked. "I wasn't ready. I was just one of them." The man's lips curled, not in amusement, but mourning. They were all ready. That was their mistake. A silence passed between them like a tide withdrawing. The forest held its breath. Then the man spoke again. "This place was not always bone. It was once the heart of the river." Before the queen sank, and Selma's gaze flicked to the trees. The air here was damp. She could smell the ghost of water, not stagnant, not dead, but stolen. She was sacrificed here. They built the altar from the bodies of her guard. They thought it would bind her soul. Did it? She asked. He didn't answer. Instead, He rose and gestured for her to follow. The altar remembers every name spoken here, and every lie. She followed. The path wound downward into what seemed like the roots of the world. A staircase of limestone descended into the hill beneath the altar, each step slick with moss, carved by hands long buried. Faint torchlight flickered from sconces that hadn't held fire in generations, but now smoldered gently as if recognizing her presence. They entered a chamber shaped like a lung, ribbed walls, damp and breathing, and in its center the body of the queen, preserved not by craft but by something deeper. Her skin shimmered with a blue sheen like oil on water. Her lips were sewn shut with gold thread, and her hands folded over a blackened book bound in river bark, sealed with a spine of bone. The man did not speak. He bowed, and Anselma understood. This was not a tomb, it was a waiting room, a place of breath held between worlds. She waits to be read, the man said finally. The book, Anselma whispered. He nodded. But I can't. She wrote it for you. And just like that, the candlelight dimmed. The chamber moaned softly, as if it too was waiting. Anselma approached the queen. Her fingers hovered above the book's cover. It pulsed faintly beneath her hand, like skin over a heartbeat. And when she touched it, the room dissolved, not into darkness, but into water. She stood suddenly within the river, not beside it. The current curled around her ankles, thick with silt and memory. Across from her, a younger version of herself stood on the opposite bank, dressed not in robes, but in her father's old coat. She was smiling. I died here, the younger Anselma said. No, she whispered. I lived. The younger her nodded. Same thing. And then the water rose over her knees, her waist, her heart. But she did not drown. She read, not words, but truths, not pages, but moments. Each bone in the queen's altar was a story. Each echo in the spiral, a vow, broken or kept. And through them all, a single truth emerged, like a root-piercing stone. Faith is not obedience. It is memory. She woke on the forest floor. The man was gone. The altar of bone now glowed faintly in the pre-dawn mist, as if it had consumed the moonlight and wept it back. And in her lap, the book, no longer sealed, no longer forbidden. She opened it, and within, a map, not of land, but of choices, wounds, names she had never heard but knew in her blood, and a final message scrawled in what looked like tears. When the river calls your name, answer not with fear, but with your own. She closed the book, and for the first time since the fire, she wept, not for what was lost, but for what waited, beyond the altar, beyond the river, beyond even death, a road, and at its end, not heaven, not judgment, but home. She stood, wrapped the book in her robe, and turned toward the east. The trees parted like curtains, and in the distance, the river shimmered again, not with warning, but welcome. The wind stirred, the bones whispered, and Anselma walked into the last chapter of her name. The snow had stopped, not suddenly, but with the stillness of a vow kept. The wind quieted, like a breath finally exhaled. In the pale hush of dawn, the monastery ruins were no longer ruins, they were fossils. Each stone held its silence, like a prayer carved into time. Ash had settled into the shape of absence, and the fire's memory no longer hissed or cried. It simply was. Anselma stood at the edge of what remained. Her feet no longer felt the frost, the ache of bone, The burden of witness had lifted. The final path was no longer ahead, but within. The tower bell, split long ago by flame, had finally stilled. But in the quiet, something else rang deep inside the stone. The slow echo of a voice never spoken aloud. You are the last psalm, and Selma, and the silence after. The river had led her here, past the drowned woods, past the breathless village, past the visions that wrapped around her sleep and pulled her dreams into fire and smoke and the soft lips of the dead. The river had curled like a serpent through her hours, and now it bowed its head. She stood on a ridge of blackened heather, her shadow long and narrow, pointing like a needle through the heart of morning. Below her, the final figure approached. He was neither priest nor pilgrim. His robe bore no symbol. His eyes bore every season. He walked not with menace, but with memory. And when he reached the last stone, where her sisters had once knelt in dawnlight, he removed his hood. His face was not unfamiliar. It was every man who had ever wept in secret, every father who'd buried a child, every monk who'd watched a candle die. His voice, when it came, did not startle. You were meant to carry it, he said, and Selma's breath fogged the air. What? The last litany, the one that ends in silence. She didn't answer. Her hands were clasped, not in prayer, but in remembering. Each knuckle, each cracked nail, each vain part of the script she had walked with since the fire. He did not come closer. The abbey was a chrysalis, not a tomb. And this? She asked, her voice low, her throat tasting of salt and ash. What is this place now? He looked past her, to the far hills, a wound that remembers healing. She lowered her gaze. The frozen earth shimmered faintly, as if dew had fallen from invisible hands. In her heart, a whisper pulsed at him she had never sung aloud, but always known. It had no words, only rhythm, like walking, like breath, like sleep. He turned. Then, and left no footprints, on Selma remained. Around her, the world did not cheer or awaken. It rested. Finally, trees no longer moaned, stones no longer bled. Even the birds had chosen quiet. She descended the hill not as one in exile, but as a keeper of silence. Her path curled gently, following the stream, not the river that had pulled screams from the mouths of cowards, but the brook that once ran through the cloister gardens. Beneath its surface, the water moved slowly, as if recalling what it meant to nurture. At the bend, where rosemary once grew wild, she paused. The ground had thawed, and Selma knelt and pressed her fingers into the damp earth. She scooped a small hollow. The soil smelled of life. She reached into her robe and pulled from its folds a single seed round, dark, wrapped in the silk of old prayer. No one had told her to bring it. No one had told her what it would become. She placed it gently in the ground and covered it with her palm. And then she waited. A minute, an hour. A season folded in shadow. Nothing rose, nothing bloomed. But that was not the point. She stood, wiping dirt from her fingers. Behind her, the wind lifted just slightly, like the hem of a departing cloak. Above, the sun did not shine, it watched. And Selma turned toward the east, where the hills faded into pale clouds. She walked, not toward a calling, not away from grief, but into the space between. A life not as a sister, not as a ghost, not as a survivor, but as a silence that knew its name. Somewhere behind her, a bird called out. and was answered. In the valley below, the villagers slowly emerged from the prayer of winter. The blacksmith found his forge, still warm beneath the ash. A child's shoes were found beside the well dry and neatly tied. A window opened in the chapel with no roof, and through it drifted a scent no one could place. Not rosemary, not lavender, something older, something returned. And on the ridge where fire had kissed its last breath, the soil split. A stem rose, pale green, slight as a whisper, holding the weight of the world like it had never burned. The final psalm had not been. Soon it had been planted, and it would bloom in silence, forever, forever.